Welcome back, my friends. Tonight, I am here once again, sitting in the deep stillness of a long night to tell you a story that does not begin with a throne, does not begin with towering walls, and does not begin with writing, books, or the first cities of humankind. Instead, it begins before all of that in a vast darkness of time that we often pass over in just a few short lines of history books, as though it hardly mattered, as though before civilization there was nothing worth saying. But it is precisely that gap, that lost 100,000 years, where the greatest secret of humanity may be hidden. Because if today we are able to build cities, write poetry, create machines, name the stars, and sit quietly, listening to stories in the night, it is not only because of the first kings, it is because of the nameless people of prehistory, the ones who lived, who loved, who feared, who grieved, who stared into darkness and found a way to walk through it when the world did not yet possess even a single lamp. And if you stay with me until the end of the story, perhaps you will realize that the greatest mystery is not the pyramids, not Atlantis, not the empires buried beneath sand and dust, but a question as old and as deep and as cold as the wind outside your window tonight. What did humans do for 100,000 years before civilization began? And in that darkness, what was quietly shaping us into who we would become? Settle in a little deeper now. Pull your blanket closer if the air is cool tonight. Lower the light if you wish, and let this voice carry you very far back, farther than every dynasty, farther than every temple and palace, back to a time when our ancestors did not know they would one day become builders of glowing cities, did not know they would record history, did not know their descendants would raise libraries, make telescopes, and send machines into the sky. At that time, they knew only cold, they knew hunger, they knew the sound of footsteps on damp earth, the scraping wind through tall grass, the shifting of great animals in the gray dark before dawn, and the small flicker of fire trembling like a living creature in the endless black. That is the first thing we tend to forget when we think about those lost 100,000 years. Humans did not begin as victors. They began as fragile beings, slow, with no sharp fangs, no claws, no thick hide to withstand winter, no legs faster than deer, no strength greater than wild cattle. What they had were skillful hands, minds that could remember, imagine, and feared danger before it fully arrived. And those seemingly small gifts quietly changed the world. The 100,000 years before civilization were not an empty waiting room. They were the long age in which humans learned how to become human. They woke with the first light, when dew still clung heavily to the grass, and cold still clung to their hair, not to admire the sunrise, but to inspect the footprints near where they had slept, to see whether some predator had passed in the night, to see whether herds had moved through the area, to see whether that day held any hope of water, wild berries, edible roots, or a careless band of antelope out on some distant rise. Their days were long and rarely the same because every day was a direct negotiation with nature. If the weather turned colder than usual, they had to gather more wood, force themselves to leave shelter and hunt farther, though they knew that going farther meant risking never returning. If the herds changed their route, the group had to gather everything they could carry, babies strapped to backs, stone tools tucked into leather pouches, glowing coals preserved as carefully as a seed of life, and then begin walking again, day after day, across grassland, forest edge, riverbank, frozen plain, wherever hope led them. That was the oldest rule of human life before fields existed. If you wanted to live, you had to move. People ask what humans did during that lost 100,000 years, and the first answer is simple, almost humble, and yet immense. They walked more than we can easily imagine. They crossed valleys where the wind screamed like spirits. They followed coastlines where the tides rose and fell like the breathing of some vast living earth. They moved over frozen plains where footprints were erased by snow a few hours later. They went from place to place, not from curiosity in the modern sense, but because life itself was always moving just ahead of them, like a door that stayed open only for a moment. And in those journeys, stretching from generation to generation, humans did something that may seem small, but was truly enormous. They turned the earth into home, not by building walls, but by remembering. They remembered where water could still be found in the dry season. They remembered which caves blocked the northern wind. They remembered when fish returned, when fruits ripened, when dangerous cats stalked the reeds, when a certain grove held poisonous berries, and when another offered food. They remembered the sky, the seasons, the habits of reindeer, mammoths, aurochs, horses, antelope. And in that collective memory, the world slowly changed from an overwhelming terror into a living map stored in human minds, never written on paper, but passed by word, by gesture, by pointing hands, by old people indicating a line of blue mountains and telling the children that when the moon grows thin twice, the animals will return there. Before books, memory was the library. Before maps, the horizon was an open text. Before schoolhouses, the campfire was the first classroom of humankind. Around that fire, people did not only eat and warm themselves, they told stories. They told of the hunt from the day before, when one of the men nearly died beneath the horns of a wild bull and survived only because of one desperate spear thrust. They told of a place far away where stones rang when the wind blew through them. They told of a child born under a dim sun. They told of a dream in which the dead stood beside the water. They told stories to remember, to teach, to warn, to comfort, and also to make the fear of the night feel a little smaller. And perhaps it was in those stories, in that age before cities, that the first true civilization quietly began, the civilization of imagination. Because humans did not only see what stood in front of them, they began to see what was not there. They looked at tracks and saw where an animal had gone. They looked at the sky and saw a season approaching. They looked at a body lying still and sensed that the silence inside it meant something beyond flesh. They looked at fire and saw a being both helpful and dangerous. They heard thunder and could not believe it was only meaningless noise. They imagined causes, meanings, spirits, invisible wills. In other words, before humans built cities, they built a world inside the mind, and that was perhaps the most important construction of all. But those 100,000 years were not made only of quiet fires and soft storytelling. They were also a history of pain. There were winters so long that when someone coughed in the darkness, the whole group went still, because everyone knew that might be the sound of someone who would not survive the cold. There were children who failed to grow because there was too little food. There were hunters who never came back. There were mothers who had to keep walking after burying a child in the gravel by a river, because staying longer meant the whole group might die. There were mornings when they woke to the footprints of saber-toothed cats around their sleeping place. There were droughts that shrank rivers to threads when animals vanished and people dug into dark mud to find the last dirty water. And yet, in such a brutal world, humans did not become entirely hard like stone. Ancient remains show us that they cared for one another more than we often expect. There are skeletons with severe injuries who lived many years after being wounded, meaning someone brought them food, someone walked more slowly for them, someone did not leave them behind. There are very old people who survived long after losing all their teeth, which means that in an age when every bite mattered, the community still softened food for them or shared in ways that allowed them to keep living. compassion was not a luxury. It was one of the most important survival technologies. Humans survived not only because they knew how to kill, they survived because they knew how to hold one another up. Before civilization, there was already morality in its earliest form. Before laws, there was care. Before religion built sanctuaries, there was already the quiet act of kneeling beside the dying. And they did not merely survive, they mourned. One day, far back in the past, perhaps on a cold afternoon, a group stood around the body of one of their own who had just died. They might have abandoned the body to the scavengers, as many animals do, but they did not. They dug into the earth. Though the ground was hard and their tools were crude, they laid the dead person carefully. Perhaps they placed beside the body a stone blade, a carved bone, a shell necklace, a few flowers, or perhaps only the touch of a living hand on a dead brow one final time. Why, we do not fully know, but that moment tells us something immense. Humans had begun to feel that life could not simply end like a fire going out. Mystery entered human history very early, not in a palace, but in a grave. And from then on, darkness was no longer only the darkness of night. It also became the darkness of questions. Where do the dead go? What is a dream? Why do we hear the voices of those who are gone in sleep? Why does the sun leave only to return? Why does winter kill the green world and spring bring it back? Those prehistoric humans may not yet have had mythology as a system, nor scripture, but the seed of the mystical was already there. Some old voice must have told children one night that lightning was the sky's spear, that the stars were the fires of those who came before, that the howling out on the plain was not only the wind, but the land itself calling to be remembered. They could not endure a silent universe, so they made it speak. And while they were making meaning, they were also making skill. Never underestimate a stone tool. To modern eyes, a sharpened flake of stone may seem crude and poor, but to prehistoric people, it was the difference between life and death. Which kind of rock could be split properly? At what angle should it be struck? How could an edge be thinned without breaking? How should it be hafted to wood? Should it be tied with sinew or plant fiber so it would not fly loose when thrown? None of that knowledge appeared by accident. It was the result of thousands of generations of experiment, failure, observation, and teaching. A good stone blade was a triumph of accumulated intelligence. A balanced spear point was early material science. A well-coordinated hunting group was strategy. Elders taught the young where to stand against the wind, when to wait, how to avoid the horns of a wild bull, how to use ravines and slopes to trap a herd. Little by little, humans did not merely live in nature. They began to read its rules. They noticed that an animal tires more quickly under a hot sun if pursued long enough. They learned that a herd avoids human scent when the wind shifts. They learned that certain landscapes could be used to funnel prey into narrow passes or toward cliffs. They learned when to risk and when to retreat. And then there was fire. Ah, fire. Perhaps no companion of early humanity was ever both more beloved and more feared. At first, they may only have captured it from lightning-struck trees and kept it alive from ember to ember, watching it like a difficult, temperamental spirit. Later, slowly, they learned to tend it, as his end eventually to make it. When humans gained control of fire, the night changed, food changed, the body changed, the mind changed. Fire drove away predators, brought warmth against freezing air, softened meat, made poisonous roots edible, and most importantly, extended waking life beyond sunset. It created a circle of light in the sea of darkness, where human faces could be seen clearly, where people could look at one another, tell stories, laugh, soothe children, and remember the dead. It may even be that around those first fires, language itself grew richer and more subtle, because humans were no longer only shouting warnings or pointing at prey. They now had time to talk about what had happened, what might happen, and what had never happened at all, except in imagination. They could speak of a place where the sun slept, of a beast too large to hunt, of a woman who dreamed the river called her name, of a spirit hidden in stone, and thus the inner world grew wider and wider. And perhaps one of the strangest things our ancestors did in those missing ages was something so ordinary, so quiet, that it is easy for us to overlook it. They watched for an impossibly long time. They watched the flight of birds before rain. They watched insects gather in certain places before the ground softened with coming storms. They watched rivers swell and shrink, like living veins beneath the skin of the land. They watched the faces of one another, learning to read fear before fear had words, grief before grief had ritual, hope before hope had language, rich enough to describe itself. In a world before walls and towers, observation was power. To notice one small change in the sky might mean food. To recognize one unusual silence in the grass might mean danger. To sense that an old trail was no longer safe might mean the difference between a sleeping child and a dead one. Over thousands upon thousands of years, human beings became readers of the world, long before they became writers upon it. They learned to read clouds, mud, bones, ash, fur, wind, and silence itself. Perhaps that is why, even now, something in us still listens closely when the world grows too quiet, still feels a faint unease when birds suddenly stop singing, still looks to the horizon when the air changes. And then there was time. The missing 100,000 years were not only filled with movement across landscapes, but with movement across the invisible river of time itself. At first, perhaps humans lived more from moment to moment than we do now, bound tightly to the urgency of the day. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. They began to remember the past, not merely as a set of accidents, but as a pattern. They began to expect the future, not merely as surprise, but as return. The cold would come again. The herd would cross again. The fish would gather again. The dry months would strip the river thin again. The moon would fatten, fade, and return again. And in learning these cycles, human beings were doing something extraordinary. They were beginning to live in more than one time at once. They lived in the present, yes, but they also carried the past inside them, and they stretched themselves toward the future through anticipation. Once a creature can remember deeply and prepare deliberately, it is no longer only surviving the world. It is beginning to negotiate with time. Long before the first seed was planted on purpose, the human mind had already been planting expectations into tomorrow. Long before the first calendar was carved, the sky had already become a clock in the imagination. There is also another possibility, quieter and more haunting. Before civilization, humans were not only learning how to live together, but how to be alone. Imagine one person wandering a short distance from camp at dusk, perhaps to gather wood, perhaps to check traps, perhaps only to breathe for a moment, away from the noise of children and smoke and hunger. The sun is low, the cold is gathering, the land is vast and indifferent, and for the first time, perhaps, that person feels not just fear, but self-awareness. Not merely, I am in danger, but I am here. I am separate. I am small beneath this sky. I exist, and one day I will not. Stone does not preserve thought. Bone does not record wonder. But surely, sometime in those 100,000 years, a human being stood alone beneath the stars and felt the weight of being alive. Surely someone looked at the night and felt both terror and amazement. Surely someone listened to the breathing, dark, and understood, however dimly, that the world was far older and larger than any one life could contain. In that moment, Philosophy may have existed before philosophy had a name, and grief changed shape too. At first, perhaps loss was only shock. A body gone cold, a voice gone silent, an absence beside the fire. But over generations, grief may have become memory, and memory may have become attachment to the dead. People may have spoken names after death. They may have avoided certain paths because someone once walked there. They may have carried objects that belonged to those who were gone. They may have looked at a child and seen the gesture of a grandmother, the eyes of a brother, the voice of someone already beneath the earth. If so, then ancestry began long before kings traced bloodlines and priests kept records. The dead remained present, not through documents, but through imitation, storytelling, and longing. The first ancestors were not carved in stone. They were carried in the body, in the campfire voice, in the way one person crouched, laughed, or turned toward the wind. And we should not imagine prehistoric life as simple. A person in those ages had to know astonishing amounts about the world around them. Which root nourished and which root poisoned. Which animal could be approached and which could kill in a breath. Which stones broke cleanly and which shattered uselessly. Which clouds carried harmless cold and which signaled deadly weather. Which members of the group could be trusted in panic. Which sounds in the darkness meant wind and which meant pause. Their expertise was not stored in libraries. It was stored in nerves and reflexes, in stories and gestures, in scars and habits. To the modern eye, they can seem distant and primitive, but place one of us alone in their world, stripped of tools and electricity and roads, and we would quickly understand how sophisticated their intelligence truly was. They knew how to live in direct conversation with reality. And perhaps the most moving part of all is this: they did all of it without knowing they were standing at the beginning of everything. They did not know they were pre-civilized. They were not waiting for progress to arrive and declare their lives incomplete. Their lives were fully real to them, fully urgent, fully sacred in their own way. The warmth of a fire mattered completely. The cry of a newborn mattered completely. The return of a hunter mattered completely. The burial of the dead mattered completely. Their world was not a rough draft of ours. It was a world entire unto itself, rich with terror, tenderness, mystery, and meaning. Before there were kingdoms, there were campfires. Before there were laws, there were promises. Before there were monuments, there were graves. Before there were scriptures, there were dreams. Before there was civilization, there was the long night, the cold wind, the patient fire, and the human voice speaking softly against the darkness. And perhaps one of the most important things humans did in those missing ages was learn how to carry invisible worlds inside them. A person in prehistory did not only carry tools, fire, skins, and food. They also carried memory, expectation, warning, and myth. A hill was never just a hill once it had nearly cost someone's life. A river was never just a river once a child had been born beside it. A cave was never just a cave once the dead had been laid within reach of its shadow. This meant that the world early humans walked through was layered. Beneath the physical land was another landscape made of association and feeling. Every journey became more than movement through space. It was movement through remembered meaning. To pass a certain tree might stir grief. To approach a valley might awaken fear. To arrive at a shoreline might bring relief so old and so deep that no word existed for it. They no longer lived only in the material world before their eyes. They also lived in an emotional world that traveled with them, wrapped around the land like a second skin. And from that came another hard lesson. Nature could be both mother and executioner. The same river that gave water could flood without mercy. The same herd that brought food could vanish for months. The same fire that warmed sleeping children could leap and destroy shelter in a breath. The same forest that offered wood, fruit, and hiding places could also conceal claws, venom, and slow death. Blessing and danger often wore the same shape. The world was generous, but never tame. It fed them, but did not belong to them. It gave them life, but asked a price for every day it extended. Perhaps in learning this, humans developed that ancient instinct, which still lingers in us now. The instinct to stand before mountains, oceans, storms, or wild forests, and feel something more than simple admiration. We feel humility, we feel unease, we feel awe, and absence became a force too. A hunter gone too long, a child's laughter suddenly missing, a familiar voice not heard at dusk, a pair of footprints leading out and none returning. In such a life, absence was not empty, it was active. It pressed on the minds of those who remained. The missing taught as much as the present. A vanished herd meant hunger. A vanished person meant grief or fear. A vanished season meant climate had changed. A vanished path meant the land itself had transformed. Once absence becomes emotionally powerful, the mind begins to fill it. Where did the missing go? Why did the animals not return? What happened beyond the ridge? What remains of a person after the body is still? Questions like these do not belong only to civilization. They belong to any people who have watched things vanish and felt that the emptiness left behind was speaking. And yes, surely they laughed too. Somewhere in those 100,000 years, someone slipped in mud and turned a frightened moment into relief. Somewhere, a child imitated an elder's serious face and made the fire circle burst into grins. Somewhere, a hunter exaggerated a story until even the exhausted could not help but laugh. Laughter in such a world would not have been trivial. It would have been medicine. It would have been release after fear, warmth after strain, a way of restoring the group after tension threatened to harden everyone into silence. Before civilization, before theaters, before written jokes, before satire and comedy and performance, there was already the human need to bend pain briefly into joy. And those ancient people were learning to notice one another as distinct souls. In a small band, everyone mattered. One person may have been especially good at finding water, another at calming children, another at reading tracks, another at remembering routes, another at sensing tension before conflict became dangerous. In a world with so little margin for error, individuality was not abstract. It was practical, intimate, essential. Yet beyond practical value, there may also have emerged something deeper: recognition. This one grieves differently. That one is brave in hunting, but frightened by dreams. Another seems quiet, yet remembers everything. Another is reckless, another tender, another unpredictable, another wise. Long before literature, human beings were already studying one another by firelight. They were already learning that survival depended not only on understanding animals and weather, but on understanding the mysteries inside other human faces. And perhaps night itself shaped them more deeply than we know. Before civilization, night was not simply the absence of day. It was a domain, a kingdom of altered rules. During daylight, the world could be read with the eyes. At night, it had to be read with the ears, the skin, the memory, and the imagination. Distances changed. Familiar places turned strange. Small sounds became loaded with meaning. The stars emerged in numbers too vast to ignore. Fire became more precious. The human group pulled closer together. Night magnified both danger and intimacy. Day belonged to movement, labor, searching, pursuit. Night belonged to waiting, listening, healing, telling, wondering, reflection, myth, fear, consolation, the imagining of unseen beings, the remembering of the dead, the private confession, the song, the first question too large to ask in the brightness of day. Night did not merely threaten them, night educated them. And perhaps one of the most important things humans did in those missing ages was learn how to build trust. To sleep beside another person is trust. To let someone carry your child while you cross a freezing stream is trust. To believe that the hunter returning over the hill brings meat and not trouble is trust. To follow an elder into unfamiliar land because he says there will be water beyond the ridge is trust. Suspicion may keep a person alive for a night, but trust keeps a people alive across generations. Somewhere in those 100,000 missing years, long before laws were written and contracts were sealed, human beings were learning how to depend on one another in invisible ways. A broken spear could be replaced. A broken trust could destroy a group from within. And with trust came choice. Should the group stay near this river one more week or move before it fails? Should they hunt the large animal and risk injury or settle for smaller prey and slower hunger? Should they welcome strangers approaching in the dusk or prepare to defend themselves? Should they carry the weak and move slowly or abandon them and move fast? Intelligence was not only a gift, it was a burden. To be aware is to be burdened by uncertainty. To imagine the future is to fear it more vividly. To remember the past is to compare one possible decision against another. Before civilization, before philosophy, before legal codes, human beings were already living with dilemmas. They were already carrying the weight of judgment. At the same time, humans were becoming creatures of place, even while they remained constantly in motion. A people may wander and still feel that certain valleys matter more than others, that certain caves are not merely shelter, but memory, that certain rivers hold the presence of generations, a place where a child was born, a place where a mother was buried, a place where the hunt succeeded after weeks of hunger, a place where strange lights once moved in the sky. Landscapes stopped being empty terrain and began to gather emotional weight. They became story-soaked. They became sacred, or feared, or beloved. Long before ownership, there was attachment. Long before borders, there was belonging. Some places did not merely keep them alive. Some places knew them, and perhaps they were already performers of reality. The hunter returning from a dangerous chase does not simply arrive with the story inside him. He reenacts it. He shows, with his hands, how the animal turned, how close the horns came, how the spear flew, how the earth shook beneath its last collapse. Children stare, elders nod. The group gasps at the right moments. Experience becomes performance. Memory becomes shared emotion. A single event is transformed into a communal possession. Perhaps this happened not only with hunts, but with dreams, encounters, losses, and wonders. One person saw something, but through voice, gesture, rhythm, and repetition, everyone else came to feel they had seen it too. Before all of that, there was the fire-lit body, the moving hand, the rising and falling voice, and the ancient human urge to make others feel what one person had lived. And courage was being made too, quietly, patiently. A child afraid of the dark learns to carry water a little farther from camp. A young hunter trembling before his first great animal steps forward anyway. A grieving mother rises after loss because the group must keep moving. An injured elder teaches while pain burns through the body. Courage, in such a world, was not a grand speech or a banner lifted before an army. It was the quiet refusal to surrender to fear when fear was entirely reasonable. It was there in childbirth without safety. It was there in winter travel. It was there in tending fire through storms. It was there in the first person who entered a deep cave with only a trembling flame. It was there in every burial, every migration, every decision to love, despite knowing how easily life could be taken away. And as they learned more, mystery did not disappear. It grew sharper. A hunter who knows animal behavior intimately may become even more awed by the intelligence of a herd. A woman who knows plants deeply may feel even more wonder at how life hides medicine in roots and poison in berries that look nearly the same. A person who studies the stars night after night may not feel less mystery, but more. Pattern itself can be mysterious. Order can be mysterious. Repetition can be mysterious. Why should the moon return? Why should the seasons turn? Why should life cling so stubbornly to the world? Understanding did not banish wonder. It sharpened it. And perhaps the most beautiful truth hidden inside the whole story is that survival alone was never enough. Again and again, our ancestors did things that went beyond immediate necessity. They painted when painting did not fill the stomach. They buried when burial cost time and energy. They adorned the body when ornament gave no direct protection from cold. They told stories when silence would have conserved strength. They remembered the dead when forgetting might have been simpler. Even before civilization, humans were already reaching beyond bare existence. They wanted beauty, meaning, connection, continuity. They wanted the world not only to sustain them, but to speak to them. Civilization did not create humanity's depth, it inherited it. And perhaps they also learned how to wait beside a trail for animals to appear, to wait through the night beside a feverish child, to wait for the river to fall, for the cold to break, for a lost hunter to return, for pain to ease, for dawn to reveal whether the danger has passed. Waiting was never empty. It was full of tension, imagination, memory, and hope. A person waiting is already living partly in the future, already reaching beyond the present moment toward an outcome not yet known. They learned not to act too soon, not to move too late, not to waste strength in panic. Some things could be chased, but others could only be endured. And the world may have felt haunted to them, not because of ghosts in a simple sense, but because events leave traces in feeling. A clearing where something terrible happened might feel wrong, even in silence. A cave where the dead were buried might seem heavier, darker, fuller than other caves. A valley where the hunt always failed might gather a reputation. Perhaps memory clung to place so strongly that some locations became charged with dread, comfort, reverence, or sorrow. They inhabited not just a physical world, but an emotional geography, and resemblance must have carried enormous power. A child begins to move like someone who has died. A young face takes on the expression of an old one. A voice echoes another voice. In a world without portraits, without writing, without family trees, resemblance may have been one of the strongest ways the past remained visible. The lost were not fully lost if their gaze returned in a child, if their walk returned in a hunter, if their habits reappeared in a daughter, a son, a grandchild. The body itself carried continuity. Flesh remembered what words could not fully preserve. Rhythm too must have entered deeply into human life. Rhythm in breath, in footsteps, in hammering stone, in repeated chant, in the crackle of fire, in waves, in rainfall, in heartbeat, in the synchronized movement of a hunting group. Rhythm organizes fear. Rhythm steadies the body. Rhythm turns many individuals into one motion. A repeated sound in darkness can calm children. A repeated movement can teach memory. A repeated chant can give courage before danger. Perhaps long before instruments were shaped with intention, The human body itself was the first drum, the first metronome, the first patterned sound against uncertainty. Hands clapping, feet stamping, voices rising and falling together around the fire. They found patterns strong enough to hold the mind together when the world remained uncertain. And humans became guardians of thresholds, thresholds between firelight and darkness, between the safety of camp and the danger beyond it, between childhood and adulthood, between the living and the dead, between the known path and the unknown one. A child's first hunt, a first burial witnessed, a first winter survived, a first night spent away from the center of the group, a first dream that feels too vivid to ignore. Perhaps prehistoric communities, even in simple ways, recognize that life is not merely a line of passing days, but a sequence of crossings. To cross and be changed, to return and no longer be the same. Transformation itself required witness, and they learned to tame panic. Fear is natural, panic is destructive. One shout at the wrong moment could ruin a hunt. One rushed movement near a cliff could kill. One person losing control in darkness could spread terror through the whole group. So humans may have spent uncounted generations learning through pain and necessity how to feel fear without being consumed by it. The elder who speaks calmly while others freeze. The mother who quiets her breathing so the child in her arms quiets too. The hunter who steadies his hand even when death charges toward him. Before civilization, humans were learning the earliest forms of courage, not only in the body, but in the nervous system itself. And gradually, they enlarged the meaning of a human life. At first, perhaps life was measured mostly by hunger satisfied, cold survived, danger escaped, children protected. But slowly, life gathered other dimensions. A life could become memorable. A life could become admired. A life could be mourned in a special way. A life could leave behind tools, stories, gestures, songs, teachings, places, descendants, warnings, blessings. A person was more than a body passing briefly through the world. A person could become influence. A person could become example. A person could remain in the group after death, not just as grief, but as guidance. Then the seasons turned and generations passed. Children who once listened by the flames became the guides, and then the storytellers, and then vanished into the earth. Yet the journey went on. Some groups followed the coast, living from fish, shellfish, crabs, seaweed, and stranded animals. Some moved inland with the great herds across enormous plains. Some stayed near forests, learning the calls of birds, the cycles of mushrooms, the smell of rain. And when the climate changed, when ice advanced and withdrew, when rains came or droughts lingered, they shifted their routes as blood shifts through the body. Human adaptability in those ages was extraordinary. There were no states to rescue them, no grain stores, no weather reports, no doctors, no permanent shelters. And yet they endured eras in which stronger species vanished forever. They learned to sew skins more tightly against the cold. They learned to shape better spears. They learned to join in larger groups when necessary for hunting or defense. They learned to read the sky. They learned that each landscape had its own laws and that survival required listening to them. And intelligence deepened the mystery. Imagine a winter night at the mouth of a cave. The wind outside moans through the rocks. Inside, fire throws moving shadows against the wall. A hand, perhaps the hand of a young person, dips into red ochre mixed with charcoal and animal fat, then presses against the stone, leaving behind the negative outline of a palm. That handprint is more than a mark of presence. It is almost a whisper sent through time. I was here. I lived. I touched the stone and wanted the stone to remember me. Why did humans paint in caves? Perhaps hunting magic, perhaps ritual, perhaps storytelling, perhaps imagination, overflowing from the mind and needing a surface to cling to. Whatever the reason, such art tells us that humans, before civilization, were not spiritually mute. They already possessed a symbolic world. They already knew how to turn the invisible into image. A bison painted on cave stone was not only a bison, it was memory, prayer, fear, reverence, ambition, respect for a creature that fed the group, but could also kill a hunter in an instant. In the trembling light of fire, such images must have seemed to move, to breathe, to step out from the rock itself. And surely love lived there too. We often speak of history as though it were only war, migration, invention, and death. But between all those things, there is always two people sitting a little closer than necessary by the fire. Always a hand brushing another hand by the river. Always eyes searching for each other when the group halts. Always the quiet wound of someone who never returns from a hunt or is left behind by fever. We do not know exactly how prehistoric people loved, but surely they knew attachment, jealousy, longing, tenderness. Because without those invisible ties, how could such small bands have endured together through such terrible ages? Perhaps a young woman once kept the polished tooth of a beast that a young hunter gave her after his first successful kill. Perhaps an old man sat each winter staring at the place where his companion used to sit. Perhaps a child grew up hearing that his father was now one of the stars. And so the long journeys continued during the ages of ice, when vast lands connected places that are now seas. Humans crossed dry corridors, later swallowed by water, carrying fire, tools, memories, and the voices of their ancestors into continents where their feet had never trod before. They followed animals, rivers, intuition, and some deep force that still stirs in us even now. Go on. Some groups disappeared and were never seen again. Some were lost in storms. Some survived and left descendants in distant lands. And everywhere they arrived, they did the same old things: observe, learn, tell, adapt. Perhaps they stood before new landscapes with the same awe we might feel on another planet. Forests so dense with insect sound they seemed to hum like rain. Plains with no visible end, coasts thick with strange life. Volcanoes staining the horizon red, or curtains of green light moving across the sky, as if the heavens themselves were opening. In such moments, mystery must have traveled beside them. Before civilization, there was already belief in a mist-like form, not yet organized into doctrine, but enough to make humans feel less alone in the universe. Perhaps they believed the ancestors moved in the wind. Perhaps certain animals carried special power. Perhaps mountains, rivers, and caves possessed intention. Perhaps dreams were doors. That belief, whether right or wrong by later standards, helped them endure the world. Because when a mother loses a child, a scientific explanation of death cannot soothe grief, but the thought that the child has been led by the elders into a warmer place beyond the dark may help her stand again. Story was not only entertainment, it was medicine for anxiety, a cloak for the spirit, a cord that bound the group together. Every night, they manufactured meaning so that they would have the strength to face cold, hunger, injury, and uncertainty. Again, at dawn, as time moved on, small changes accumulated into larger ones. Language became more refined, tools became more varied, networks of exchange likely began to appear as well. When one kind of stone from a distant place turns up somewhere else, when shells from the sea are found buried with someone inland, when beads and pigments and unusual objects travel from hand to hand. A grain of red pigment, a necklace, a polished tooth might not feed the belly, but it fed something deeper, something in the human being that wanted to be seen, remembered, recognized, connected. Before the city, humans already knew self-expression. Before the palace, they already knew symbolic status and affection. Before the temple, they had small, sacred objects hanging from the neck. Then one day, somewhere on a wide grassland, a human being stood beneath the sky and realized that the moon returns in a rhythm, that stars rise and vanish in repeating order, that the sun follows a dependable path, that the cold season and the warm season leave signs before they come. Once humans recognized cycles, they were no longer merely dragged through time. They began to anticipate it. That was a silent but enormous step. Yet the story of the 100,000 years before civilization is not a straight road leading neatly to cities. It is not a design laid out from the beginning. Very likely, our ancestors stood at the edge of extinction many times without ever realizing it. There were climatic bottlenecks, droughts, bitter cold, disease, and competition with other human groups that may have driven our numbers to terrifyingly low levels. If only a few events had gone differently, perhaps none of us would be here. A child held a little more tightly through a freezing night and survived. A hunt succeeded just before a band starved. A wound did not become infected. A migration path by chance avoided a dead region. A storm came one day late. A distant group chose exchange instead of slaughter. An elder remembered the way to an old water source. That is how fragile our existence once was. So when we ask what humans did during 100,000 years before civilization, we should answer that they survived the almost impossible, and by surviving it, they created the future. But survival was not the only thing they were doing. They were also accumulating depth. Each generation added something to the invisible treasury of humankind. A little knowledge, a little skill, a little image, a little ritual. A few more words, a fear that now had a name, a hope that now had shape. One generation learned to nap stone better. Another learned to sew tighter garments. Another knew a new hunting ground. Another placed greater meaning in dreams. Another painted more beautifully in caves. Another grieved the dead more deeply. None of them knew they were laying the first stones for the distant foundations of the world to come. Somewhere, on some night, an elder must have looked at children sleeping around the fire and heard the rain outside the cave and felt time thickening in the heart like layers of ash beneath the feet. That elder may not have known letters, history, or epochs, but surely understood one thing. These children must learn what I know, or they will die. That is education in its oldest form. No board, no school, no pen, but consequences of life and death. A child had to learn the smell of danger, the direction of wind, the tracks of animals, the rhythm of the moon, how to hold a stone blade, how to make fire in rain, how to listen to elders, how to be still during the hunt, how to mourn and still keep walking. These lessons were carved into the body, into the nerves, into memory. A fawn is born already knowing almost how to run. A human child is born weak, slow, and in need of being taught nearly everything. Yet that weakness became strength, because what is taught can change, accumulate, and improve far faster than genes alone. And so, in that long, dark, seemingly slow age, humans were accelerating in a way nature had never seen before. As time went on, groups became better at cooperation, better at deception when necessary, better at persuasion, planning, alliance, and ritual. Civilization was not born only from warm fire and cave paintings. It was also born from the human ability to believe in things that cannot be touched, stories, unspoken laws, symbolic signals, honor, taboo, ancestry, spirits, promises. One person or an object with special meaning. One location became forbidden. One animal could not be eaten under certain conditions. One name was not spoken at night. All of that was culture. Before humans built cities out of stone and brick, they built invisible cities out of shared belief inside one another's minds. And so the nameless people kept walking beneath the stars, kept suffering losses, kept giving birth, kept digging graves, kept tending fire, kept reading the signs in earth and sky, kept painting, remembering, and telling. And if you listen deeply enough, perhaps tonight, beneath the hum of a fan, the wind, or some distant traffic, you might hear their footsteps echoing still from stone, from sand, from bone, from smoke, dark cave walls, because we are not separate from them. We still fear darkness in their way. We still gather around light and tell stories in their way. Only now the light comes from bulbs and screens. We still bury our dead with ritual. We still look at the sky and feel our own smallness. We still keep tokens of those we love. We still soothe children with stories before sleep. We still suspect, sometimes, that dreams might mean something. We still feel strange wonder before fire, sea, thunder, and a sky full of stars. Deep beneath our modern clothing, in the quickening of the heart, in the reflexive fear of a sudden noise at night, in the comfort of sitting close to warmth, in the urge to gather and tell stories, we remain the descendants of those who passed through the 100,000 years before civilization. Imagine the final morning of a very old man in prehistory. He wakes before the others, as always, but now his bones ache more, and his hands tremble slightly as they touch the ashes of the previous night's fire. He looks at the children sleeping close together, at the young woman holding her newborn, at the young hunter whose walk resembles his father's years ago, at the cave mouth where a gray dawn is slowly spilling in. He has traveled through lands these children know only through stories. He has survived winters many did not. He has lost brothers, friends, and loved ones. He has seen the sky turn red with distant ash from a volcano. He has run before enormous beasts. He has buried the person he loved. He has told stories to make children less afraid. And now he senses he is about to become one of the stories himself. He may not think of it in our words, but surely a certain tenderness mixed with sadness moves through him as he understands that his life, though small, has not been meaningless, because what he knew has passed into others. That is perhaps humanity's quietest victory, not merely killing the biggest beast, but passing on the fire, the memory, the way of living to the next generation. Perhaps that afternoon he dies. The group buries him. Maybe they place beside him a worn stone tool, a grain of red pigment, or perhaps only the hand of someone resting on his chest one final time. The next season, the group moves on. Rain and wind erase the signs of their camp. Grass grows, animals pass, years go by, thousands of years, tens of thousands. Then civilization arrives, invents writing, raises walls, names kings, records, victories, builds monuments. But deep under the layers of earth, that nameless old man remains, silent witness to the truth that before history was written, history had already lived. That is why the 100,000 years before civilization were never truly lost. They simply did not speak in writing. They speak through bone, ash, handprints on cave walls, broken flakes of sharpened stone, ancient graves, old migration paths, and through that strange stirring that we feel when we imagine the first human being sitting before fire in the dark. The cities blazing with light today still run on brains, shaped in the age of hunters and gatherers. Our dreams, fears, beliefs, loves, and imagination all bear the touch of that ancient time. We may wear suits, drive cars, hold phones, write books, build satellites, but when thunder suddenly cracks in the night, something inside us still hesitates, as an ancestor once did in a cave. When we sit beside a stove, a candle, or a fire, something inside us softens, as though an old part of the mind has recognized safety within a ring of light. And whenever we tell stories to one another, we are repeating one of humanity's oldest rituals. Perhaps that is why stories told late at night can reach so deeply. They carry us back to the first cradle, where the voice of one elder could calm the darkness for an entire band. So what did humans do for 100,000 years before civilization? They called the night by its name for the first time. They called fire a friend. They called death a mystery. They called one another family. They called the road ahead hope. They learned to see tracks and imagine the unseen animal that made them. They learned to keep embers for tomorrow. They learned to share food with the weak. They learned to stand beside the dead rather than immediately turn away. They learned to look at the sky and hear time moving. They learned to dream. They learned to watch. They learned to wait. They learned to trust. They learned to choose. They learned to wonder. They learned to laugh. They learned to remember. They learned to endure. They learned to cross thresholds and come back changed. They learned to carry invisible worlds inside them. They learned that a human life could leave something behind in others. And from those first dreams, humanity slowly walked toward fields, then cities, then books, then all the things we now call civilization. So if anyone ever tells you that before civilization there was only emptiness, remember this: it was in that darkness that human beings first lit the fire for the future. And perhaps the greatest secret is not what they did, but what they became through doing it. The only creature that knows it is small and yet refuses to surrender to that smallness, fighting back with memory, with compassion, with imagination. That is the real miracle. The night is growing deeper now, and my voice is slowing, like a fire settling into red coals. And if you are still here with me, then I thank you for traveling all the way through the darkness of those 100,000 years before civilization, where there were no kings to name, no dynasties to count, only ordinary people who were quietly extraordinary and who made us possible. If tonight's story touched something in you, leave a comment and tell me which feeling or which moment held you the longest. Share this story with friends, with anyone who also loves the deep mysteries of human history. And please support the channel so I can continue sitting here in nights like this one, telling you more stories slowly, mysteriously, and gently enough to follow you into sleep.